Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar participants, media, leaders of the Iranian American communities from across 41 chapters, and fellow advocates for freedom and democracy in Iran. My name is Dr. Azadeh Sami, and on behalf of OIAC, I am honored to moderate a vital discussion based on our policy paper titled Redefining U.S. Policy on Iran, Advocating Accountability and Backing Democratic Aspirations of the Iranian People. We are joined by OIAC's young professionals, graduates, and undergraduate student chapters from across the United States. Let me welcome my co-moderator today, Mr. Amir Imadi, technology entrepreneur, futurist, and more importantly, founding member of OIAC's Young Professionals from California. Welcome, Amir.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, and good to be with you all. I'm so proud to see how our teams continue to grow and expand their role in advocating for a non-nuclear, secular republic, Iran. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. We have Ms. Hananeh Amanpour, attorney at law, Ms. Anna Sami, attorney at law, Mr. Behrang Borhani, our international relations resident, and Mr. Sina Saidian, our policy resident. Welcome to all of you. We're also expecting Dr. Nilufar Ehsani to be joining us shortly. And of course, we're joined by our university research teams from Texas. We have Mr. Parsa Arya from California, Mr. Ryan Nasir. From Georgia, we have Ms. Michelle Shariati, and from Virginia, Ms. Mickey Mohammadi. We're so happy to have you with us today, and thank you for all of your support and efforts on this important policy paper, which has truly been a collective effort over the last few months.
Yes, indeed. So let me start by saying that since the Islamic Republic's establishment in 1979, Iran has emerged as a significant strategic threat, characterized by its support for terrorism, destabilizing regional activities, and its ongoing pursuit of nuclear capabilities. Washington's collective response predominantly has been through sanctions and diplomatic engagements, and that has evolved over the years. Yet, as we've observed, they've all fallen short of addressing the broader spectrum of threats posed by Tehran's regime.
This is true. An example of one of the diplomatic engagements is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. And while it was noteworthy diplomatic effort, it did not sufficiently curb Iran's malign regional activities, nor its human rights abuses. The reimposition of sanctions by the Trump administration marked a pivotal shift toward a maximum pressure campaign, which aimed to draw Iran back to the negotiating table for a more comprehensive agreement. Over the last couple of days, we've seen the office of Iran's supreme leader announcing that they are changing their doctrine regarding nuclear weapons and are willing to use them when needed. Of course, we always knew their intentions. We're going to reflect on these issues and discuss the pressing need for a cohesive and effective strategy. Our focus today will be on Tehran's endgame, both domestically and regionally, examining the Iranian pathways towards regime change in Tehran, and on the vision for transforming Iran into a non-nuclear secular republic.
Yes, well, the Iranian people have made it pretty clear through their decades of protests, sacrifices, loss of lives, that they desire an end to all dictatorships in order to have a secular, democratic republic. And to get there, we argue that the U.S. and the international community have a role to play and establish firmer policies on holding the regime in Tehran accountable. So let's begin our discussions with Sina.
Thanks, Azadeh, and thank you again to OIAC and everyone who put in all the hard work for this policy paper. One of the questions that the policy paper addresses that I think is important is that we're calling on Washington and the broader international community to really understand what the regime in Tehran wants. Washington and its allies have been misguided and misinformed about Tehran's endgame, largely due to false promises that Tehran and its influence operations in the US and Europe have distributed. And at the core of this misunderstanding is that the mullah's regime in Tehran does not act in a rational way that Western diplomats and policymakers are used to relying upon with other countries. Instead, Tehran's endgame is survival at all costs. Why? Because we're dealing with an illegitimate regime that is hated by the majority of Iranians at home and abroad, and therefore has to resort to all kinds of terrorism, warmongering, nuclear blackmail, etc. And that's why, as a result, regardless of any incentives that whether it was Democratic administrations or Republican administrations have given to Tehran, Tehran has responded in an irrational manner that continues to baffle policymakers. So a question that follows from this is, how come this regime has survived for so long? And I think the survival tactics of Tehran's regime hinge critically on two strategic pillars that work together. It's internal suppression as well as external aggression. And it's been like this since day one. And I think with this context, we can understand everything from Iran and Iraq's 8-year war, or the massive crackdown on women after the 1979 revolution, or the 1988 massacre of political prisoners, and of course, the ongoing trend of inhumane policies to this day. And I think you don't even have to take it from me. You can take it from Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who himself has said, quote, "If we don't fight our enemies in Syria, we will fight them in Iran." And this is referring to a strategy that aims to externalize Tehran's internal threats, effectively distracting from the regime's problems by creating regional instability that then, by comparison, makes Tehran look relatively stable in comparison because they can deflect blame towards external conflicts, which we all know are being caused by the head of the snake, which is in Tehran. And so by actively participating in conflicts, whether it's in Gaza, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, and by supporting groups like the Houthis in the Red Sea, Tehran seeks to establish regional distractions from its domestic rejection by the Iranian people. This is an extension about survival and is intrinsically linked to the regime's relentless internal suppression. At home, the regime employs very severe tactics such as widespread executions, crackdowns, and dissents, as evidenced by the alarming trend in recent months. Azza, let me ask Ryan actually to jump in because he assisted us with some of the research that we conducted on this front about the ongoing executions in the last few months.
Sure, go ahead. Thank you. In our research, we find a strong correlation between the regime's conflict escalations in the region and the rate of executions at home. So our first finding was that from October 7th, the day one of the Gaza conflict, to the end of December 2023, the regime executed more than 300 people. In January 2024, the Iranian regime executed 88 people. However, in the following months of February and March, there was a noticeable decrease in the rate of executions, which lined with the parliamentary elections. And this decline coincided with the intensifying calls by all sectors of society and ongoing protests for a widespread boycott of the parliamentary elections. And such calls for boycott stood in direct opposition to Khamenei's concerted efforts to feign legitimacy amongst growing internal scrutiny and international internal dissent and international scrutiny. This manipulation of execution rates around political events reveals a calculated yet all too common for this regime, a tactic to manipulate public and international perceptions. And the execution rates picked up significantly in April, where 72 people were executed, and the trend continues upward. In the first 2 days of May, the regime executed 16 people, and the trend continues upward. In the city of Esfahan, only 11 people were executed between April and the first 2 weeks of May. The regime executed one person every 6 hours, which is honestly a horrifying statistic. And we've also observed how the regime uses high-profile executions to snub pressure from the international community. For example, the execution of Navid Afkari, an internationally recognized wrestler, in 2022 was intentionally carried out to instill fear within the internal population and basically show that international condemnations won't work on this regime. And Afkari's words capture sentiment. As he stated, "I realize they're looking for a neck for their noose." The same pattern repeated on April 17th of this year, when the execution order for Tumas Salahi was made public by his lawyer, We conclude that this regime kills for two reasons: to instill fear and reject any human rights pleas by the international community.
Thanks, Ryan. I think that visual really demonstrates the horrifying correlation between how the regime reacts to internal dissent by trying to strengthen its grip on power through torture, through arrests, and through executions. I think I like to close with a little bit of context here. As we noted in the paper, the regime's officials have admitted that they are just one uprising away from total collapse, and that's why they resort to these increasing numbers of executions like Ryan just outlined. I think it's within this context that we understand that the regime's aggressive regional posturing and military actions can also be understood similarly. This is a weak regime that attempts to project strength abroad and create a distraction from its growing vulnerabilities at home. In this lens, I'd like to take a minute to recognize the importance of the congressional effort in this front with H.R. 8083, the Maximum Pressure Act, which affirms many of the points that OIAC has outlined in our policy paper. So when it comes to what the United States can do, we say it's not a question of capability, but rather of a political will to hold Tehran's regime accountable in a way that is meaningful, both for its regional and for its domestic behaviors.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Sina and Ryan, for presenting these findings and addressing the question of what is Tehran's endgame. As we also said in our policy paper, ultimately, Tehran's external aggression and its internal suppression are two sides of the same coin, designed to perpetuate the regime's rule. And that's why we must target the head of the snake in Tehran. So let's move to the next important topic, which is the question of regime change. Behrang, I would like to turn to you. Is regime change in Iran feasible? And if so, how can it be achieved?
Thank you, Azadeh. The short answer is definitely yes. But it's important that we talk about the how. We explained in our policy paper that Tehran's regime, excuse me, the IRGC, Supreme Leader, the President, the Parliament, and Basij paramilitary forces, they all fear the Iranian people more than any foreign military attacks. With that, the missing part in U.S. policy so far has been ignoring the voices of Iranians when they chant, "No to Gaza, no to Lebanon, I give my life for Iran." They're chanting to say the enemy of the Iranian people is the regime in power, and that they're willing to fight for the freedom of their own country, their own homeland. Similarly, when protesters chant our enemy is here, they lie when they say it's the U.S. They are echoing the same sentiments. These are chants from 2018 protests, which have continued throughout to this day. One recent example is after the killing of Mahsa Amini in September 2022, which was a wake-up call that showed how fearful the regime really is of its own people. We see the BBC recently publicized IRGC documents that regarding the brutal murder of Nika Shawkarami, who was killed within days after Mahsa. In these documents, it outlines how Nika was sexually molested and beaten to death by a team of IRGC members. It's heartbreaking, but the world forgets the fight that the 16-year-old Nika had to put up against these armed IRGC thugs. She was unarmed while they were fully armed. She was 1, they were 5. Now you tell me, who's afraid of who? She lost her life, but fought bravely. Nika is just one of many examples. We've laid out several factors in this paper that explains why the regime fears the Iranian people so much. I'd like to bring in my colleague Michelle to walk us through these factors.
Thanks, Behrang. As we aggregated the data from various sources such as media, social media, and public statements by regime's officials, here's what we found. So firstly, the diversity of social groups participating in the protests consists of women, youth, professionals, labor movement, teachers, union workers, different Iranian nationalities, especially the Baluchis, and religious minorities from all walks of life are challenging the regime's legitimacy on multiple fronts, including the massive election boycott that Ryan just talked about. Secondly, there is a historical context for popular uprising that has led to regime change. Iran has a history of revolution and political upheaval. The regime is acutely aware of widespread public rejection that can lead to substantial change, just like the 1979 revolution. This public rejection that can lead This historical precedent contributes to the regime's fear of mass protests because it is coupled with demand for regime change. The ongoing protests signify a rejection not just of specific policies, but of the regime in its entirety. Next, formation of resistance units and evolution of protest movements. The people have responded to the regime's unforgiving violent tactics by forming resistance units across the country. These units have played a crucial role in organizing and mobilizing protests and safeguarding the integrity and uniformity of protest messages nationwide. They've also played a significant role in educating the public so that they can evade arrest and traps by the regime's security forces. Their efforts have increased not just in numbers, but also in impact against the regime. Next, resistance units and the organized resistance outside of Iran has been effective in amplifying the voices coming from Iran. Through various platforms, including social media, the amplification serves not only to galvanize further opposition, but also ensure Iranian struggle for freedom reaches policymakers across the globe. Growing international support for the alternative to this regime. Iran's organized resistance, led by Maryam Rajavi, presents an alternative vision for Iran's future. The 10-point plan is based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. This vision is a major challenge to the regime in Tehran because it offers hope and a tangible goal for protesters and all Iranians. In the summer of 2023, more than 3,600 lawmakers from 61 parliaments in 40 countries, including 29 parliament majorities in France, Italy, the U.S. and U.K., Norway, the Netherlands, Ireland, and others declared support for Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan for a democratic, secular republic, and called for the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. I know Parsa will delve deeper into this later as well.
Thank you, Michelle. Just want to close by saying that regime change by the Iranian people is not only possible, more importantly, it's inevitable. That's why in our policy recommendations, we call on Washington to recognize the Iranian people's call for regime change and to recognize the resilience and creativity of the Iranian people in their struggle for freedom and democracy. Both of these require Washington and the international community to remove obstacles and sharpen the policy on Iran in favor of Iranian people. The time to reassess U.S. policy on Iran is now, but it has to be without any of these obstacles. Otherwise, we may be dealing with a terrorist regime armed with nuclear weapons soon.
Thank you, Behrang and Michelle. So let me ask Hanan to address this question. What is the path to regime change? How do we achieve it?
Thank you, Amir, and also to my fellow panelists. First and foremost, there needs to be a shift in U.S. policy that recognizes the Iranian people are at war with the regime in Tehran, and we must recognize their right to self-defense against this brutal regime. For over 4 decades, we've watched this regime maintain its rule through oppressive governance, systematic human rights abuses, and dire economic conditions, resulting in staggering poverty levels and the regime's prioritization of the IRGC and the Quds Force expenditures over the public welfare. What we outline in our paper is that the Iranian people's struggle for freedom should be contextualized within the framework of the just cause war theory. The Iranian resistance is not merely a response to economic hardship or political repression. It's in fact a fight for fundamental human rights and dignity. And the end goal is a government that embodies democratic values, the respect for human rights and economic justice, just as Michelle outlined when she referred to the 10-point plan. And this isn't a new fight. My own father was murdered by the Khomeini regime in 1988. So this is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. The Iranian people's right to self-defense is justified by the continuing systematic repression and the denied avenues for peaceful change. How can the Iranian people effect any meaningful change when every form of protest is met with brutal crackdowns, arrests, and executions? The people have no way of protecting themselves against this brutal regime. And so the right to self-defense is recognized in international human rights law. While international law emphasizes the importance of peaceful assembly and expression, it also recognizes the right of individuals to self-defense in the face of imminent harm. The repeated cycles of violence against civilians without recourse to justice or international intervention amplify the moral and ethical arguments for self-defense. We must stand up for the people of Iran based on moral and ethical grounds. The principle of self-preservation and the defense of one's community against unjust aggression is a widely accepted moral and ethical stance. Given the documented atrocities and the state's unwillingness to reform, the argument for self-defense is framed not just in terms of survival, but as a struggle for justice and human dignity. Let me ask Mickey to step in and share the result of our research based on international legal frameworks recognizing a nation's right to self-defense and the people's right to self-defense against authoritarian regimes.
Thank you, Hanone. In our research, we have found there are 8 applicable legal frameworks that support the people's right against authoritarian regimes. Number 1 is the United Nations Article 51, titled A Nation's Right to Self-Defense. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, member states have the inherent right to individually or collectively self-defense if an armed attack occurs against them. This provision underscores the importance of state sovereignty and the legitimacy of defensive actions in response to aggression. Number 2 is customary international law, universal recognition of self-defense. Self-defense is a principle widely accepted in customary international law, reflecting the legal and moral acknowledgement by states that defending against armed aggression is a legitimate right. Number 3 is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. Article 1, self-determination against authoritarianism. Article 1 of the ICCPR supports the right of people to resist oppressive regimes and assert their right of self-determination. This reinforces that international communities stands against authoritarianism and the support for democratic governance. Number 4 is the right to rebel, overthrowing oppressive governments. The concept of the right to rebel suggests that people have the right to overthrow governments that deny them fundamental human rights. This principle highlights the legitimacy of uprisings against tyranny and the pursuit of freedom and justice. Number 5, responsibility to protect, defending against atrocities. The responsibility to protect doctrine implies that people have the right to defend themselves against regimes committing atrocities, including genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansings, and crimes against humanity. It underscores the international community's obligation to protect vulnerable populations. Number 6, we have the Geneva Convention, conduct of armed conflict and civilian protection. The Geneva Convention provides a comprehensive legal framework for the conduct of armed conflicts, emphasizing the protection of civilians in non-combats. These conventions are critical in ensuring humane treatment during war and preventing unnecessary suffering. Number 7, we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Under Article 3, Indigenous Self-Determination. Article 3 of UNDRIP recognizes the right of Indigenous people to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. This affirms their autonomy and supports the resistance against encroachment and exploitation. Number 8, we have soft law instruments and regional treaties, rights to resist oppression. Various soft law instruments and regional treaties may recognize the rights to resist oppression. Even though they are not universally binding like the UN Charter, these frameworks provide additional support for the legitimacy of resistant movements within specific regions or contexts. Needless to say, all of these should apply to the case of the Iranian people and their struggle for freedom against this regime.
Thank you, Mickey. I just want to say in closing, in a 2009 speech in Cairo, President Obama addressed the need for countries to uphold the principles of justice, equality, and human rights. A portion of his comments that resonate with Iran's current situation and the right to self-defense is when he said, quote, I do have an I do have an unyielding belief that all people yearn for certain things: the ability to speak your mind and have a say in how you are governed, confidence in the rule of law and the equal administration of justice, government that is transparent and doesn't steal from the people, the freedom to live as you choose. Those are not just American ideas, they are human rights, and that is why we will support them everywhere, end quote. The statement underscores the universal nature of fundamental human rights and the importance of supporting people's aspirations for freedom and self-determination. It aligns with the idea that individuals and nations have the right to defend themselves against oppressive regimes that deny these rights. In Iran's case, where there are concerns about oppressive governance and human rights abuses, this perspective emphasizes the legitimacy of resistance efforts aimed at securing basic freedoms and justice.
Thank you to you both. This framework is very relevant indeed. I'd like to turn to Anna. Based on what everyone has presented so far, can you tell us more about specifically the path to regime change in Iran?
Yes, thank you, Amir. I think my colleagues have done a really good job so far presenting the foundation of the policy paper. And I just want to emphasize that, yes, the people of Iran and their organized resistance movement have a really critical role, obviously, to play in achieving regime change, but so does the international community. And when I say this, I don't mean through, military means or foreign war, which nobody wants. What I mean is that the international community, and more importantly, the United States, must demonstrate a commitment to human rights and justice through the call for accountability. And more specifically, the United States should work actively with the executive and legislative branches to identify and implement human rights sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act against those in the Iranian regime responsible for severe human rights violations. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's essentially an act that was established in 2012 during the Obama years that allows the U.S. government to sanction foreign government officials implicated in human rights abuses all over the world, and it has been used very widely since then. The international community must address the specific challenges associated with applying the Global Magnitsky Act to this regime by providing detailed analyses and overcoming obstacles, as was discussed by Behrang, to ensure the sanctions' effectiveness. Next, Washington must take into account the calls from international legal experts, former UN officials, and Nobel laureates to protect Iranian political refugees and witnesses, particularly those in Ashraf 3 in Albania. And this includes adopting measures that guarantee their safety and uphold the principles of international asylum and refugee protection. And I really want to emphasize this point because, again, the individuals, the members of the Iranian resistance movement who are located in Albania right now, many of whom are actual eyewitnesses of the massacres that occurred in Iran in 1988 when 30,000 political prisoners were executed. And many of them were able to serve as firsthand witnesses. And I can't tell you as an attorney how incredible that form of testimony is in enabling us to be able to preserve the record for such an atrocious atrocity that happened so many years ago, which is still to this day being studied by many prominent human rights organizations such as Amnesty International. And then I'm, of course, very much encouraged further, moving along by the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, which is in place as law, just happened about a month ago. The alignment of U.S. sanctions with those of major allies as outlined in House Resolution 815, which could significantly impact the political and legal landscape by intensifying the economic and international pressure on Tehran's regime by synchronizing sanctions with the EU and the UK so that it's not just the United States alone. I think that that's an essential element. That will create a more cohesive and robust international stance against the human rights violations and the aggressive behaviors by this regime. So specifically, as I mentioned, the House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, Michael McCall, was the one who introduced the 21st Peace Through Strength, which specifically targets Russia, China, and Iran. And when it comes to Iran, specifically, they call for sanctions on, for instance, ports and refineries that receive and process Iranian oil. Further, they restrict the export or re-export or export of U.S. origin goods to Iran. Most importantly, they fully enforce human rights sanctions on the Iranian regime, which I think is essential that we emphasize. And then, of course, it requires the president to brief Congress on the finances of Iranian leadership and requires financial institutions to close accounts connected to those individuals. So I think this sort of, in closing, these are the types of tools that we're talking about that lead us to really have successful, a successful regime change. And I would say, to finish that, in studying a lot of other countries, as you can see that, we've outlined in our paper, I think the struggle against apartheid, which of course occurred in South Africa, combined armed resistance with international pressure, internal protest and economic sanctions. And that is what eventually led to the negotiation process in the early 1990s. And this process culminated in the end of apartheid, the establishment of a democratic South Africa, and the election of Nelson Mandela as president in 1994. And we would say that Iran could follow such an example. And again, the emphasis being on a united front and isolating the Iranian regime and its major actors.
Anna, thank you. These are great points. With all these encouraging developments, it begs the question, what is holding up regime change in Iran? The people are ready. There's an organized resistance movement inside and outside of Iran. There is support by U.S. Congress, and President Biden has signed into law the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, which holds the Iranian regime accountable for terrorism, human rights crimes, and regional wars. So what is the holdup? Let me ask Niloufar, can you talk about the obstacles preventing regime change in Iran?
Thank you, Amir. Yes, there are several obstacles that the Iranian people are facing. As we mentioned in our policy paper, the number one obstacle is really the policy of appeasement. And what we mean by that is basically when it comes to dealing with Tehran's regime, Washington has been stuck in a rut. So it really feels like the US sees only two options. Either we fight with Tehran, engage with them in some sort of militaristic fashion, or we try to talk things out diplomatically. And this has kept Washington going in circles because the Iranian government is not acting in good faith here. It's not using these talks as a way to actually affect change. It's just using them as a way to gain legitimacy. So here is where we argue that there needs to be a major policy shift, that there is a third option, and that is to end this appeasement and support the Iranian people's call for regime change. A second obstacle is dealing with Tehran's influence operations. In 2023, Semafor reported that Iranian-backed operatives, including Ariana Tabatabai, had significant access to sensitive US information while working within the State Department. Tabatabai was involved in influencing policy from within, participating in the nuclear negotiations as part of former State Department Iran envoy Rob Malley's team, and she's currently employed at the Department of Defense. So here we see direct manipulation and infiltration that poses a serious national security concern. And in light of these alarming revelations about Tehran's espionage and influence within the US, along with its targeted misinformation against opposition groups like the MEK, there really needs to be a comprehensive review of US policies towards Iran that is essential. Tehran's strategy has included demonizing its primary opponent through propaganda and misinformation. And this approach has really obscured U.S. policy, distracting it away from the main focus, the core threat, which is Tehran. The impact of such influence operations, whether that's through direct nesting of operatives like Tabatabai or misinformation, has really created a policy quagmire vis-a-vis Tehran. And there really needs to be an unbiased and fact-based comprehensive review of US policy towards Iran by our policymakers to break this cycle. Another obstacle is the hostage diplomacy. The use of hostage diplomacy with Tehran has been evident in various situations, including a notable case involving Asadullah Assadi, an Iranian diplomat who was arrested in Germany in 2018. He was found guilty of a bomb plot against the annual Free Iran gathering in Paris. This is an event that's attended by thousands of Iranian diaspora, as well as many distinguished political leaders from the US and Europe. I know many of the panelists here today attended that event, and thankfully that plot was foiled. And in February of 2021, Assadi received a 20-year prison term for his involvement. But subsequently, Iran released 3 European prisoners in exchange for Assadi in a diplomatic prisoner swap. And engaging with Iran in this manner is only going to beget more hostage taking and invite more terrorism to the US and to Europe. And this really needs to end. And then another obstacle, or a final obstacle to consider, is perhaps what is a fear of failed policies in the past. Notable examples of Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. Washington, in looking at these as examples, overlooks a crucial distinction that Iran is fundamentally different in terms of its role in the region. This sort of oversight fails to acknowledge Tehran's significant support, for example, of Assad's regime in Syria, and the fact that without Tehran's assistance, the Assad regime could have been toppled by Syrian opposition. So recognizing this fact is really important in that it highlights Iran's influence on the region's instability, and it underscores the importance of acknowledging the organized resistance within Iran itself. It's also really important here to recall the wrong approach towards the Iranian opposition that Washington has had in the past, namely the blacklisting of Iran's main opposition group, the MEK, along with the broader coalition, the NCRI. And they did this in order to curry favor with Tehran. These were unsubstantiated. This was an unsubstantiated designation, and it was contested in US high courts. Ultimately, it was removed, but it did serve to bolster Tehran's standing while stifling dissidents inside Iran. So these are some of the main obstacles that we recommend trying to remove as we shift policy away in another direction and apply maximum pressure to the Iranian regime. And the rest is really up to the people of Iran and their resistance units. I'm going to ask Parsa now to join in and share our research about how Iran is ready for change to a secular republic.
Thank you, Nilovaj. Our research has shown that the 2022 protests in Iran and the activities of the resistance units against the IRGC and Basij forces highlight the growing domestic and organized opposition to the regime's authoritarian rule. These protests, characterized by widespread participation across different segments of Iranian society, they signify a critical evolution in the Iranian people's ongoing struggle for freedom and democracy. The resistance activities, particularly those targeting these forces, yes. Well, you know, they underscore the courage and resilience of the Iranian people in their quest to dismantle these structures of repression, and they lay the foundations for a new era of governance in Iran that aligns with their democratic aspirations. The regime has also been very active in discrediting or demonizing the opposition. Since the 22 uprising in Iran, Tehran's regime has been very busy propping up fake opposition to dilute the decades of work by the authentic movement for change, like Rajavi's movement. Fake opposition and failed coalitions are seen among former regime officials from both hardliner and reformist factions, various celebrities, both from inside and outside Iran, pro-monarchy groups, and various popular personalities whose sole agenda has been based on self-promotion and opportunistic timing to hijack the real agenda for change on the streets of Iran. Nonetheless, Rajavi's organization has the ability to power through and forge an all-encompassing plan for a future Iran that resonates internally and has support from the international community, as Michelle talked about earlier. We have also discovered that Rajavi's movement has remained immune to the regime's infiltration, exploitation, or even its manipulation. The resistance units inside Iran focus on spreading her message for future Iran through banners and posting across bridges and city centers and office buildings. The 24/7 exiled broadcasting funded by the diaspora connects Rajavi's events across Europe and the U.S., including major rallies in Western capitals and visits with lawmakers around the globe, with those inside the country. Rajavi's leadership of an organized opposition is also very appealing to the women of Iran and the broader women's movement globally. So, the Iranian journey is no different from that of other countries. Let me see. Could you all pin the table? Sorry, thank you. All right, this table right here, it highlights the diverse pathways through which countries have achieved or advanced their democratic governance, from revolution upheavals to gradual evolutionary reforms. Look at how different countries have made their way to democracy. Some, like the United States and France, had these big revolutions that changed everything. Others, like the United Kingdom, took a slower approach with gradual changes over time. Iran's experience will be based on its history and more than a century of struggle to establish a secular republic. The people of Iran rejected the monarchy with the 1979 revolution. They're rejecting theocracy in this revolution and are aiming for what is reflected in Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan.
Thank you, Parsa. I want to close by saying that we not only need to remove the existing obstacles to shift the U.S. policy on Iran, but we really need to be mindful of the of what the Iranian regime is doing to distract attention away from authentic opposition. So I really want to leave everyone with some guidance, especially those in Congress and in the media, with some simple guidance on recognizing the right democratic alternative to this regime. First, I would say ask if they reject the regime in its entirety. Second, ask if they believe in a non-nuclear Iran. Third, ask if they believe in a secular Iran. And finally, ask if they believe in a republic Iran. And through these questions, you really should be able to filter out those fake or failed opposition groups or distractions.
Yes, well, thank you so much to Nilüfer and Parsa and really all of my colleagues on this panel today for your incredible teamwork in bringing this policy paper together and presenting it today. I would like to just read out our 3 policy recommendations. So first of all, accountability for human rights violations. So we must implement targeted sanctions enforcement against Iranian officials responsible for human rights abuses, including the arrest, torture, and execution of political prisoners and demonstrators. So now we have what was mentioned before, the Maximum Pressure Act and the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act. Now with those in place, the White House has more tools at its disposal for more comprehensive sanctions against Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, Ibrahim Raisi, the president, and their affiliated offices for human rights violations and support for terrorism. We must also support international efforts to investigate and prosecute these abuses, engaging with the United Nations Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court. And this accountability should, as U.S. Congress has already called for, include regime officials' role in the 1988 massacre, as well as the massacres of the pro-democracy protesters since 2017 that we've all heard about. So we need to back initiatives aimed at safeguarding the 1988 witnesses to Tehran's crimes against humanity, particularly those residing in Ashraf 3 in Albania, as was already alluded to earlier, and ensuring that their testimonies and voices are heard by the free world. Secondly, we must support the Iranian people's rights. We need to recognize the Iranian people's struggle to establish a democratic, secular, and non-nuclear Republic of Iran. We need to recognize their rights to self-defense and to confront the IRGC and repressive forces to bring about change within the framework of international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need to increase our political and moral support for the Iranian people, including their efforts of organized resistance, advocating for human rights and democracy. And of course, not to forget the protection and safety of Iranian political dissidents, including those who are in Ashraf 3 in Albania, and many of those of whom are former political prisoners and witnesses to crimes against humanity in Iran. Lastly, we need to forge a united front against Tehran and the IRGC. So there needs to be an international consensus on the IRGC's destabilizing role in the region and its involvement in terrorism and human rights violations. And as such, because of that, we urge European and Canadian allies to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Furthermore, we need to coordinate multilateral sanctions and diplomatic actions against the Iranian regime. We should also work with international partners to issue joint condemnations and resolutions against Tehran's actions, which would diplomatically isolate the regime, as was already mentioned before. So please email us at info@oiac.org to receive a copy of our policy paper, and it will be made available on our website shortly. We're now going to open it up for questions. You can either raise your hands to come off mute or drop your question in the chat. So I'm going to move to the Q&A here to see if we have any questions. Okay, just wait a second for any questions here. Just 1 minute.
It looks like we have a question from the chat.
From the chat, okay. All right. So what are some practical ways to end the appeasement policy? So let's see. I believe we need to. So who would like to? I'll open it up to all of you. Who would like to answer this question here? Oh, I believe we can direct it to Nilüfer. Nilüfer, if you wouldn't mind answering this question, please.
I think it really comes down to shifting our frame of thinking. As I sort of mentioned or alluded to, there doesn't have to be this dichotomy between either we engage in diplomatic and assume that this regime is not going to act or is going to, it's going to be changeable, it's going to be reformable, and so we engage in conversations and diplomacy, or we act militarily. And I think we really need to break dichotomy as in our minds as U.S. policy, that the way is to isolate them diplomatically, to support the Iranian people in their struggles against the regime. We need to end the engagement of hostage diplomacy, and we need to, what it comes down to ultimately is recognize that they have a right to defend themselves against this regime. So that is what I would say.
Okay, great, thank you. Hannah, if you have any other points to add to this question?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, it's really important to recognize that the people of Iran are at war with this regime. Look, the Iranian people haven't been sitting around in a tower all these years waiting to be rescued by the West. And we've always said that regime change can only come from within. But U.S. policy continues to stall the Iranian people's efforts at self-determination. They must have the right to defend themselves. And a shift in U.S. policy from an appeasement policy to really holding this regime accountable is certainly a step in the right direction to achieving this goal, but it also works in other ways to put the necessary pressure to effectively weaken the regime's internal suppression and external aggression. The regime is already at its weakest point. They're long overextended in their wars abroad, and meanwhile, the people in Iran are starving. So if U.S. policy on Iran is to demonstrate its commitment to democracy and human rights, then it must confront the head of the snake in Tehran, end its appeasement policy, and endorse the Iranian people's right to defend themselves.
So is the next question is the issue of recognizing Iranian people's right to self-defense the only obstacle? But so Hannah, if you wouldn't mind, chiming in on this one. And also, of course, others can also add to this as well.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's certainly not the only obstacle, but it does top the list. Really, we have to look in the sort of broader spectrum of the U.S. policy on the U.S. appeasement policy and what can be done within that framework to effect change, not only in terms of endorsing the people's right to defend themselves and to self-determination, but also continuing to put pressure on the regime and continue, inside the country and abroad, and making sure that they're being held accountable for their actions.
Well, great. Well, the next question is, the protests in Iran seem to have died down. Can you explain what you recommend can go at the pace of what is happening on the ground? I mean, this question goes, really, we can direct this to Behrang and Michelle, but of course, others can chime in as well.
That's a good question. It's one that we hear a lot these days, that we don't hear so much about it anymore in the news, and it seems like the protests have died down. The fact of the matter is that these protests are evolving. I believe Parsa showed in the chart, every country goes at its own pace and has a different way of achieving what revolution is to them based on their own internal and external factors. What we're seeing in Iran is that the revolution, the uprisings, the protests, they haven't stopped. They've evolved, and they've turned into ones that are more sophisticated and focused on resistance units, and identifying the most effective ways to fight against the regime without risking arbitrary arrest or being killed, in cold blood on the streets. So it's not that the protests have died down. It's that they've evolved and they've turned into a different form of protesting.
Great, thank you. We have a question here in the Q&A, and someone submitted this question. What are the characteristics of a viable alternative, and how can one measure how viable an opposition movement is? So I think this is a good question for Sina to answer, if you wouldn't mind answering this one.
Sure, I think there's several characteristics that really stand out as being important for defining an opposition. I think core to those, one would be having a strong leadership base and a consistent vision. Second being having consistency in their advocacy. Third being actually capability to not only fight against the regime today, but actually create a democratic government in the future. And I think there's very few organizations that can meet any of those standards. And there's only one that really stands out to me that meets all three of those standards, being the MEK in the National Council of Resistance of Iran, led by Mariam Rajab. Take a look at the first bullet, which was having a vision, which has very basic fundamental ideas like democratic governance, like the separation of church and state, like a commitment to gender equality, commitment to religious freedoms, economic freedoms, the abolishment of the death penalty, etc. Having a very concrete, simple, easy to understand platform that has been consistent, not just for the past 5 years, not for the past 10 years, but since day one, since the 1979 revolution, when the NCRA refused to sign the Velayat Farid, the constitution of the Khomeini revolution, and said, we will not compromise with any form of government that is not democratic, does not respect the rights of the Iranian people. So that's on the fight for consistency. Second, for the capability, you've got two things. You've got the resistance units inside of Iran that many people have alluded to already that have been organizing these operations all across the country, whether it's intelligence operations to extract information from the IRGC and expose it to the world, whether it's creating uprisings, organizing them with these consistent chants of death to the dictator, death to Khamenei. This shows the capability to actually stand up for what they believe in, to fight against this regime, and then facilitate a free and fair election afterwards through these resistance, to demonstrate their support for the 10-point plan of the NCRA, as well as all across Europe and elsewhere. I think these 3 points really show that the NCRA is the only capable and effective and well-organized opposition to lead this resistance.
Sina, thank you very much. I'd like to conclude the webinar here by thanking all of our panelists and thanking all of our attendees. As was said, you can email us at info@oiac.org, that's OIAC.org, to receive a copy of the policy paper. And it will be made available on the website. But more importantly, we're also going to share it with political parties, that is the RNC, DNC, and other members of Congress and the White House, because we hope that they consider our policy recommendations as the U.S.'s official approach toward Iran. Once again, thank you so much for your time, and happy belated Mother's Day to all of you mothers, and wish you a wonderful day.